all over Scotland, England.
Good morning, church.
Yeah, good morning, everybody.
Welcome to
Tell you about it.
LargsNaz on Sunday morning. We want to welcome our online audience as well. And good to have all of y'all here with us in person. By the way, our online viewers have increased pretty dramatically over the last week or so.
Yes, they have.
Not quite sure what's going on. I have some ideas, but we're glad to have you with us online wherever you are, and glad to have you all with us here as well. Good to have some people back with us who have been away. Jim and Margaret, good to have you all back with us again. And John, good to have you up here with us. And Andy, we appreciate you playing guitar while Neil's away. And they'll be back, I think, next week.
Yeah.
Great to have Frank with us as well.
Everybody here.
Sure. Yeah, this week, I don't know if you know, but this week was the 114th birthday of the Church of the Nazarene. October, was it 13th? I think so. Was the day that the several churches met in Pilot Point, Texas, and formed the Church of the Nazarene. So happy birthday to the church. Our church is not quite that old.
We had our first takeaway homemade cookery workshop here yesterday, and a little later in worship we're gonna tell you guys a little bit more about it. But it was a great day. It was a really great day. You can see the artwork that was produced by the young ones that were here, and some new ones from Frankie. Thank you. So we'll fill you guys in just a little bit about that. But let's sing. Let's worship.
Happy birthday.
to give you guys an update on yesterday. So Takeaway Homemade are what we're calling our cookery workshops that we're doing here at LargsNaz. We have 5 adult Takeaway Homemade workshops, and we have 2 that are specifically for kids, Takeaway Homemade Kids. We are partially funded by a gift from the Largs Community Council and from the North Ayrshire Council. They've funded part of these workshops, and the rest has been funded by you all generous people. So thank you so much, church, for all that you're doing, for helping us reach the community. Yes. We couldn't do it without you. So we launched the information about Takeaway Homemade on social media. They did a little article in the paper. They're going to do a larger article. They're just waiting on us to write it for them, and just so they get our name right. And yeah, it was posted that way in the last one yesterday. So anyway, the workshops are hands-on. We had 12 hands-on places for people, and they're actually cooking what we're cooking in the class. And then we have other spaces for people who just want to watch and learn. And so we had a full house yesterday. I think we had 25, 26 people here, not including us. And most of those people have never stepped foot in this church before. So it was an amazing time of fellowship and just working together. I was telling Steve that when we started, so I had one cooker between 2 people. So 2 people were sharing and working together, but they didn't know that when they got here. So they were sitting in their chairs kind of straight ahead like this. And I said, now you all are going to be working in teams, so you have a partner. And instantly their body language went zoop, and they were like, hey, this is awesome. And they were so, it just immediate. The camaraderie and the fellowship, the whole tone changed. They were kind of nervous at first, but then when they realized, I've got a partner in this, the whole tone changed, and it was just beautiful. So these are just some pictures from yesterday. Those are the ones that were cooking. You can't see the spectators behind them. Those are just the folks that were cooking. We made leek and potato soup, which is what we had today. And there they are. There's Jan. And there we are. This guy right here in the bottom left corner is Danny. He's our neighbor. He lives on the bottom floor of our flat. So he came, and that was awesome. There he is again. Some more people cooking and doing their thing. This lady in the pink was a spectator, so she's just kind of watching what's going on. And there's me. There's Jan again. So what I've done is I've asked Claire and I've asked Jillian to share kind of their favorite moments yesterday. So who wants to go first? Claire, you want to go first? Yeah. Do it together? Oh, sorry. There you go.
So I think the highlight for me yesterday was definitely the kids. I came as a spectator. I'll maybe watch it on YouTube. Sorry, Tasha, to find out how to do it because we were kind of preoccupied. But one of the kids in particular, they were just drawing away. They were, you can see all the drawings up there. Tash had printed out vegetables and different things for them to do, and then they started just coming up with their own pictures. But out of the blue, with no prompting from anybody, one of the wee girls said, this picture is for your whole church. Oh. And I just thought that was amazing. And that's when we said, well, if it's for the whole church, we should really put it on the board. And then when the other 2 kids realised it was going to go on the board, then we had a bunch of pictures, didn't we? And then when the class was finished and the parents came back to get the kids, one of them said, I'm going to come to church every day. I said, well, it is on tomorrow, not unplugging it, but it is on tomorrow. But you just never know what connections and where that will lead to, so it was just an amazing day, and I'm glad to be part of it.
Yeah, I think the people that were here, like Tash said, you know, we haven't seen them before or whatever, so I think that sometimes in church you feel like we've got closed doors, you know, and again, Alan, something I think I said before, you often talk about we get to get out there, so I suppose that was doing it the opposite way, getting people in here, you know, so it was really lovely, and the atmosphere was really positive and relaxed, and people all were smelling things, and it was lovely that people, they must have felt at home because they were bringing their plates and things at the end and asking if there was a cloth to help wipe up, and so I think people probably felt quite at home. Yeah. So I suppose this was church really that we were coming into, but it didn't feel, you know, like church. And I think also I learned a couple of good tips about you have to share the one about the broccoli. Okay.
Yes.
Actually, I'll just share it quickly, Brian. So the stalk of your broccoli, you know, you always chuck it away, and it's such a big bit of veg, but you can just chop the end off, take the skin, or the outer skin off, and chuck it in the pot, slice it up. So it was great even to pick up a couple of tips myself, I think. Yeah, really nice atmosphere.
And nobody wants to go away at the end, they all hung about, speaking to each other, speaking to others. Just what we do on a Sunday.
Yeah, that's right.
So that felt good.
Yeah, like one person at least was saying, in fact, I think there might have been another person as well, they said, look, I come out to things like this because one person had lost her husband, you know, like a year ago or so, and was saying, you know, so I come to things like this just for something like completely lost, and she was sitting with the kids, you know, so she got some, and then in the afternoon she was just away home. I was saying, what will you be up to? And she said, I'm probably lying on my couch and watch TV. That's where I'm at the moment, you know, it's all I do. So she'd had a morning more positive, you know, being among the food. So.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Thank you. Thanks.
And that photographs that my daughter-in-law has shared throughout China.
Oh, that's right, that's right. Yes, I need those photographs. They're great. They're really great. It was such a great time, and there was such a diverse group of people that were here from all walks of life. And it was just it was a lovely snapshot of Largs, you know, it was just absolutely lovely. So we're excited. Next week we have the Takeaway Homemade Kids. We have 8 kids and 8 adults signed up for that. After yesterday's post on social media, the online ticket, it's not sales, they're just reserving them because they're free. The tickets, I mean, just started going nuts. So people are registering, and I mean, we already have about 6 or 7 people registered for the next Takeaway Homemade and for the Lunch and Learn. So we have them all on Eventbrite. So we have like 8 people signed up for the Lunch and Learn, which it's really exciting to see that happen. So y'all keep praying for this ministry, because I really do feel like this is a great way to just connect with our community in a new way. So we're excited. There we go. All right. Let's go to worship. How great the chasm that may be between us, how high the mountain I could not climb. In desperation, I turned to heaven and spoke your name into the night. Through the darkness, your loving kindness to cancel the beach cleanup that was scheduled for yesterday. And they had a lot of community support, and I think Fishworks and Morrison's had all donated things for it. I believe Soups and Scoops had also said they would give out soup to all the volunteers. So it was very supported by the community. Sadly, it had to be canceled because of rain and just the bad weather. And you know, I was sitting there thinking about that. I'd been messaging with Angela, the coordinator of that, and you know, and I'm thinking, I think it's a wonderful thing. I love it. I think it's great for the community. But every day should be beach cleanup day. Every day. This is our Father's world, you know. He loves this world, and we should love it too and take care of it. And so I just wanted to kind of remind us of that when we see trash, we should pick it up. You know, some rubbish, pick it up. And Steve and I were talking about when we go out to look for sea glass, I need to get some of those, you know, the things that you use to pick up the rubbish on the beach, and just keep them with us and clean up. So hopefully when they reschedule it, we'll all be able to be very supportive and take part in it. So just wanted to remind us of that.
good to be all together here in one place, the body of Christ, united in worship and fellowship. Amen? Amen. Now, this is the third Sunday in our sermon series for October called Scary Stories. And we have looked so far at a couple of stories that have indeed been scary. We talked about the rapture and the second coming on the first Sunday. And then last week, we heard about Jesus and the disciples' experience out on the Sea of Galilee when Jesus was asleep, but the disciples were terrified because of the storm that came out of nowhere. And they asked Jesus why he doesn't care that they are perishing. And Jesus wakes up and calms the storm, but the disciples' fear doesn't dissipate just because the storm is gone away. Just because the wind and the waves have died down, they are still fearful because of the realization that Jesus has done what only God can do. And we learned that the Greek word for that fear that they felt was phobos. It's where we get the English word phobia. And we also learned that phobos is the word that Mark uses to end his narrative. When the women at the empty tomb realize that Jesus has risen from the dead and that the apocalypse, the kingdom of God is at hand, they're afraid. They feel, well, it's hard to say. They feel fear. They feel phobos, fear. You know, from a medical and a scientific standpoint, fear happens when certain behavioral and physiological effects take place. That is, things you do and things you feel, things that take place in your body. And we all know what fear feels like. Your heart pounds and your mouth gets dry and the hair on the back of your neck stands on end. You might start to tremble and shake, and your senses are heightened, your pupils dilate, and you feel frozen. And your mind kind of races, deciding whether you need to run away or stay still. And that's called the fight or flight response. And we all experience it when we perceive a threat to our integrity, to our wholeness. When we're afraid we might lose some part of or even all of ourselves. And we saw that last week, when the disciples asked Jesus, don't you even care that we're perishing? Don't you even care that we might lose our lives? That we might be eradicated? That we might cease to exist? Now, fear is very much about the desire to avoid losing something. The desire to maintain our integrity, our wholeness, our oneness. And at a very basic level, fear is the reaction to a danger that threatens to take something from us. And in the animal kingdom, we see that fight or flight response for a very basic reason. And that is this. That reason is because animals eat each other. An animal, a fish or a bird or a mouse or even a person can become prey. Even those who are predators, who feed on others, can find themselves becoming prey in the right situations. And that is a scary thing. It's why sharks and lions and tigers and bears scare us, because we don't want to get ripped to shreds and consumed. We like our body parts to stay together and keep working for us. We like for our lives to continue. And so animals are very cautious about getting into situations where their integrity might be compromised, where they might be broken into pieces and consumed and die at some point in the process, because that's terrifying. And people can feel the fear that comes with the threat of loss of bodily integrity, even when they're just observing it. Hearing a story about it or watching a movie in which it happens, because we are built to have empathy, to feel fear vicariously. So if a person is watching a horror film, you know, one of those scary movies like Psycho or Halloween or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I've never seen, by the way, and have no desire to do so. You know the kind. Darkness falls, and in the woods or on a boat or in a creepy hotel somewhere, there's a bloodthirsty murderer stalking his prey in the night, and they're going to get hacked to bits. You know, even though the person watching that movie knows that they themselves are not in any real danger, they're not going to get mutilated and dismembered, but they will still feel scared. They'll demonstrate a fear response because they identify with what's happening in the story. And some people don't find that experience pleasant at all. I'm one of them. While other people will pay money to see a scary movie. But motion pictures didn't invent that experience. Long before motion pictures, artists were telling scary stories with motionless pictures. And works of art have been able to portray situations that stir the senses, that elicit that vicarious sense of fear and danger that comes with the threat of loss of bodily integrity. And one story that has been represented time and time again in the art world is the story of the beheading of John the Baptist. Because if you think about it, it's got all the basic elements that make folks fearful in it. Because John very obviously loses his bodily integrity. Like prey in the hands of a predator, he is dismembered. And then his head is placed on a platter as if it is food to be consumed. And all this takes place at a party, at a dinner. Thinking about the power that an individual could have to do that kind of evil, to create that kind of loss, is terrifying. And so lots of painters over the years have painted the story of the beheading of John the Baptist. And some folks look at these paintings and find them dark and disturbing, even disgusting, while others find them exciting, even inspiring and beautiful. You know, all of the synoptic gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tell us about the death of John the Baptist, how he's beheaded and his head is served up on a silver platter, but only Matthew puts the story of this evening meal that Herod puts on right next to the story of another evening meal. And doing so, I think, really adds to the meaning of both of them. But I don't want to jump to my conclusion just yet, so let's start at the beginning. Now, if we look at the first 21 verses of Matthew's Gospel in chapter 14, that's where we find these two evening meals. And the second evening meal that Matthew describes there is the familiar story of the feeding of the 5,000. That begins in verse 13. And there we read, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat." So if we begin with verse 13, we have joined Matthew in the middle of a story that began back in verse 1 of chapter 14. So we, of course, immediately ask, what did Jesus hear? When he heard what? Now, if we back up to verse 1, we'll know what Jesus heard. Matthew writes, beginning with verse 1. These are in your service notes. "At that time, Herod the ruler heard reports about Jesus, and he said to his servants, 'This is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead, and for this reason, these powers are at work in him.'" Now, Matthew tells us that Herod the ruler heard about what Jesus was doing. Now, of course, we first hear the name Herod in Matthew's Gospel way back at the beginning in chapter 1 when he tries to use the three wise men to lead him to the Messiah. And then he has all the baby boys in the whole land killed, chopped to bits. He's a real kind of piece of work. He's not a nice guy at all. But this King Herod that's Matthew's talking about here in chapter 14 is his son, who rules over Galilee. And so at this point in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus has been baptized by John the Baptist, and he's been tempted in the wilderness, and he's chosen his disciples, and he's been going around the country teaching and preaching and telling parables and healing people and casting out demons, that kind of thing. And so Herod hears reports about what Jesus is doing, and he tells his servants that he thinks that John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, has come back from beyond the grave, and is working through this one they call Jesus. And he's sort of right. he's sort of on the right track, because it certainly is the same power that was at work in John the Baptist, that is at work in Jesus. But he's incorrect about Jesus being John come back from the grave, but by mentioning being raised from the dead, Matthew gives us a little glimpse, a little foreshadowing of what's to come. But we get the idea that what's going on in Herod's head, in his mind, has to do with a guilty conscience. Maybe he's feeling some conviction, perhaps like the pounding of the telltale heart in that horror story by Edgar Allan Poe. John's prophetic voice is haunting Herod, just as it had done in life. Now in death, it's rebuking and reminding him and calling him to repentance for the evil that he's done. Matthew tells us about one particular evil thing that Herod has done in the next few verses. Look at verse 3. For Herod, this is backing up to the past. For Herod had arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been telling him, it is not lawful for you to have her. Though Herod wanted to put him to death, he feared the crowd because they regarded him as a prophet. Now, when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company, and she pleased Herod so much that he promised on oath to grant her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter. The king was grieved. Yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guest, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and the head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, who brought it to her mother. His disciples came, took the body and buried it, and they went on and told Jesus. Now, Herod had stolen his brother's wife and married her. Now, his brother's name was Philip, and his wife's name was Herodias. And John the Baptist had reprimanded Herod for doing that. Matthew tells us here in verse 4 that John had been telling him, it's not lawful for you to have her. And Luke in chapter 3 of his gospel tells us that when John the Baptist rebuked Herod for stealing his brother's wife and all the other evil things he'd done, Herod locked him up in prison. Now, Matthew tells us that Herod wanted John put to death, but he was scared of the people, of the population, because all the folks considered John to be a prophet, so he just locks him up. So while John's locked up in prison, Herod's birthday comes around. Now, some scholars think it might have been the anniversary of the day that he became king, his coronation day, but others think it was his actual birthday. But anyway, on that day of celebration, Herod throws a big party, a banquet, a feast for his invited guests. And at that banquet, Matthew tells us that Herodias' daughter danced before the company. Now, she would have been Herod's stepdaughter. Herod's brother's wife's daughter. Her mother's Herodias, Herod's stolen wife, and her biological dad is Herod's brother Philip. So she would also have been Herod's niece. And her name is Salome. Now, Matthew doesn't tell us, but we can figure that out from some other historians. And when we read these words today, she danced before the company. We might just sort of run over them and think, well, that's no big deal. But that kind of dancing, the kind of dancing that would have been going on at a party like Herod's, would not have been, let's say, wholesome. In fact, it would have been the kind of dancing that most of Matthew's Jewish audience would have found offensive and vulgar and, well, sinful, if we're honest about it. But even to Herod's circle of friends who were at that party, the idea that a member of the royal family would do such a dance for the people and for her stepfather and uncle would have been scandalous. But Herod is not offended. In fact, he's pleased. He likes what he sees. And this gives us some insight into his personality. Now, remember, he's the kind of ruler who will take any woman he wants, even his brother's wife. These days, we might call him a sexual predator. And so, in his lustful frenzy, he tells Salome that he'll give her anything she wants. And this is also his chance to show off in front of his guests, to show them he has the power to grant any request she might make. And so Salome, she's kind of prompted, kind of guided, manipulated by her mother, Herodias, because Herodias whispers in her ear, because this is Herodias' chance to get something she's wanted for some time. And so Salome says, bring me the head of John the Baptist on a platter. She wants it put down on the table in front of her like it's some sort of dish to be served, like it's dessert at this banquet. Cut me off a big piece of John the Baptist and serve it up, she says. And it's at that point that Herod remembers his fear of the people. And Matthew tells us he's grieved. But he swore an oath in front of the whole company of people, so he can't back out. So he's in an uncomfortable position. He has no choice. So he orders that John be beheaded. Right then, and his head's brought on a platter and placed before Salome, who gives it to her mother, Herodias. Now, Matthew has painted a gruesome, terrifying picture of decadence and debauchery and disregard for life here in these few verses. Matthew certainly has told us a scary story. But what I want to suggest is that Matthew has also painted a picture of the way that several powerful forces work, the way that power can be used to affect other people, to achieve certain ends, to satisfy desires and appetites. Matthew has told us of the way that Herod uses his imperial power, his power as emperor, to arrest John and throw him into prison. But Herod doesn't want to put John to death, even though he wants to, really wants to, but he doesn't want to, because he's afraid of what people think of John. So the power of public opinion is preventing Herod from putting John to death, from executing him. But then, at Herod's birthday party, at his birthday banquet, Herodias uses the powers that she has at her disposal, the power of the parent, the power of persuasion, to convince her daughter to use her body and her beauty and her sensuality, to use the power of the temptations of the flesh, the power of seduction, to prey upon the weaknesses of Herod, and to lead him into a state in which he would promise anything. And he does. And then, because he's made this boast in front of everybody, in front of an audience, the power of fear of damaging his own reputation leads him to do what Salome requests. Because he wants to demonstrate that he does possess the power to meet her request. Herod exercises the power he holds to bring terror, to end life, the power to kill and to satisfy Herodias' appetite for destruction. And so in the middle of this feast, this banquet, this evening meal, this corrupt celebration of wealth and opulence and carnal delights, Herod brings death on a silver platter. Because he's a powerful ruler. He is a powerful predator. But at the end of this scary story about a ruler who wields power, earthly power, who's influenced by the forces of pride and greed and lust and fear, this predator who fulfills the desires of the bloodthirsty in an attempt to silence the voice of a prophet, at the end of this story, Matthew tells a story about another kind of ruler, another kind of power, another kind of banquet, and another kind of place among another kind of people. This is not the end of the story. There's more to come. And so Matthew sets up an opportunity to contrast these two rulers, these two leaders, these two kings of men. And the contrast could not be more stark, because while Herod is a predator who brings death and destruction and dismemberment to a table of wealth and abundance, Jesus is the one who willingly becomes prey in order to bring life and abundance and wholeness to a table of need and scarcity. Matthew tells us in verse 12 that John's disciples collected John's headless body and they buried it. And then they tell Jesus what happened. Now, we don't know what happened to the other piece or pieces of the corpse. There are actually several churches and at least one mosque around the world that have in the last 2,000 years claimed to have John's head or his arm or some other body part in their possession. Now, whether they're right about that, I'm not qualified to say, but I suppose that it's certainly possible that at some point John's disciples told somebody, why don't y'all keep the heat? So that brings us to verse 13. When Jesus heard this, he got in a boat and went off by himself, out in the middle of nowhere, into a deserted place. Now the Greek here lets us know that this was an uncultivated and unpopulated place, a place that was deserted and solitary, a place where Jesus could have some sort of what Pastor Tasha and I call alone time, to think and to pray and to meditate and to rest. And this is what we find Jesus doing in verse 13. And it shouldn't be surprising that he would need to do so. He had just heard the horrific, terrifying details of the violent death of his friend John, who had baptized him, who had prepared the way for him. A man Jesus calls in Matthew chapter 11 a prophet and more than a prophet. He is Elijah who is to come. Jesus says of John the Baptist that among those born of women, no one has arisen greater than him. So the death, the gruesome, gory, humiliating death of John the Baptist must have shaken Jesus to his core, and surely must have been a reminder of the violent demise that a prophet could expect to meet. A reminder that his time on earth was limited. A reminder that the predatory power of the state, the principalities of this earth, would one day rise up and tear into his flesh and strike him down as well. So Jesus had a lot to think about and pray about out there in that boat. And considering the fact that Herod believed that Jesus was the resurrected John the Baptist, who Herod had already killed once and would surely not hesitate to cut into pieces again, it would have been understandable if Jesus decided to flee to another country, like his parents had done back in the beginning of Matthew, to Egypt, when he was just a defenseless newborn. But that is not what happens. Matthew tells us that the crowds of people who had been following Jesus hear about where he is, and they show up on the shore in that dark and desolate place. And that when he comes ashore, Jesus has compassion on them. He sees that they're in need, and he cures the sick among them. And it's here that we find the miracle that all four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, write about. Matthew tells us that evening had come. Darkness had fallen. Now, if we were watching a scary movie, we might think, uh-oh, this is bad news. This can't be good. You'll remember last week that when Jesus and his disciples got into that boat before that storm came up, evening had come. And in Matthew's gospel as well, this is a signal. This is a signal that something's about to happen. He's used this signal in his gospel before. Matthew 8, verse 16 tells us, when evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. Matthew tells us that evening has come just before Jesus walks on the water later on in chapter 14. And in chapter 27, Matthew tells us that as Jesus hung upon the cross, even at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, darkness falls upon the land. Evening came. And when evening came, God was about to demonstrate his power over the darkness. When evening comes, God's about to demonstrate his power over the darkness. And that's what happens here in chapter 14. Evening had come. You know, evening comes in our lives sometimes as well. We go through dark times. Sometimes the darkness falls and things get scary. We find ourselves in desolate, dangerous places. In the middle of the night when the predators roam, we might find ourselves hungry too, in need of some sustenance and comfort and healing. And the Gospels remind us that when evening comes, God's about to demonstrate his power over the darkness. The Gospels remind us that when evening comes, God's about to demonstrate his power over the darkness. And so Matthew tells us that the disciples approached Jesus. And as is always such a good idea, they tell him what to do. They give him some direction, some advice. They offer him the benefit of their wisdom and insight. The disciples say to him, listen, Jesus, it's getting late, it's getting dark, and these people need to get something to eat. And since we're out in the middle of nowhere, there's not a Tesco or a McDonald's or even a Chippy for miles around. We need to send everybody off someplace else, wherever they came from, so they can buy some dinner. Now, these would not have been wealthy, well-fed people. These were people who were in need, physical need, financial need, spiritual need. That's why they followed Jesus. He offered hope in the midst of poverty and oppression and scarcity and fear. And so Jesus carefully considers the words of his disciples, their advice, and he could have said, well, that makes sense. In this place, at this time, it'd be prudent to send these folks away and tell them to go get their needs met elsewhere. We're in a rough place, and it's dark, and these people want, even need, what isn't to be found here. That's not what Jesus says. And he also doesn't say, thank you for bringing this to my attention, I'll handle it. No. Jesus says, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. You do it. Jesus has just told his disciples in chapter 10 that he's sending them out with the power to heal and to raise the dead and cleanse the lepers. And here they are, ready to send this crowd away just because they're hungry. You do it, Jesus says. You give them something to eat. The disciples' reply is predictable. We have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fish. The disciples are saying to Jesus, you must not understand the situation, Jesus. There are thousands of people here in need. We're in a place where there are no providers. It's dark and desolate out here. And our resources are not sufficient to even begin to meet these needs. Now, maybe if we were in another place, in another time, with better resources, now then we might think about tackling this problem. But as things are, we just need to send these folks away. We have nothing but. And it's right there that the disciples begin to understand what they are called to do. They don't say, we have nothing. They say, we have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fish. They look at what they do have with honesty and clarity. It ain't much, but it ain't nothing. So what does Jesus say about these 5 loaves and 2 fish? Bring them here to me. Just as Salome had said, bring me the broken body of John the Baptist. Jesus says, bring me those loaves and fishes. And Jesus takes the loaves, bread that will in time symbolize his own body broken for the salvation of the world, and he breaks them. He breaks them and blesses them and the fish. And notice this, it's important, he gives them back to the disciples who give them to the crowd. This miracle is sometimes called Jesus feeds the 5,000. But that's not quite right, because it's the disciples who feed the crowd. The disciples that Jesus tells, you give them something to eat. And it's the disciples who give what they have to Jesus and then find it more than sufficient to meet every need in abundance after it has been blessed and broken. And every person in that great crowd of thousands eats and is filled, not just given enough, but filled. And the leftovers, the broken pieces, fill 12 baskets, 1 for every one of the disciples. And these broken pieces are a reminder of the sacrifice that will be required from every one of these followers of Jesus. Of the fact that, like John the Baptist, these disciples may find their bodies broken and their lives taken from them. But death is not the end of the story, because there's hope through the crucified and resurrected Jesus, the one who says, "This is my body, broken for you. Take it and eat it, that you would be made whole." In these two stories in Matthew's Gospel, we see the contrast between two powerful rulers. One predatory, earthly ruler who acts out of self-interest, driven by worldly appetites and motivations, who walks in darkness and deals in violence and corruption and consumption. But Matthew tells us of another, the heavenly ruler on earth, who meets the needs of others through his disciples, who transforms scarcity into abundance, who brings life from sacrifice and brokenness. Herod had the power of the predator to eliminate, to break the body, and to consume, to bring death and fear. But by becoming prey, by yielding his life in atonement, Jesus has the power to multiply, to distribute life by way of the broken body, and in so doing to conquer fear and darkness and even death itself. In the stories of these two evening meals, Matthew proclaims that the predators of this world do not have the last word. The darkness does not prevail. The predators of this world do not have the last word. The darkness does not prevail. Those who follow the one whose body is broken in sacrifice and raised up in glory, even though they may walk through the valley of the shadow of death, they can say, "Death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" For they have no fear. I'd like for our worship team to come on up. Those who follow Jesus can walk without fear, fearlessly through this life, even though there are forces that want nothing more than to devour them, nothing more than to consume them. And there are a great many things that can consume us, can consume our days and our lives and our hours and our attention and our hearts and our minds. But we can walk without fear because we have a light in the darkness, a waymaker, a promise keeper who never stops working. Even when we don't see it, he's working. He never stops.
Let's continue to worship.
You are here, moving in our midst. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, working in this place. I worship you. I worship you. You are here, moving
Thank you for giving what you have. Thank you for the way you love Jesus. Thank you for the way you show the love of Jesus to others. Christ is working through you, through his church, to reach those who so desperately need to know the amazing, uncontainable, unchanging, inexhaustible love of Christ. Thank you for being part of that. Thank you all this morning for worshiping with us. It's been a wonderful day. May God bless you and keep you. And we'll see you again soon.